104, The Ancient Past Lives of George W. Bush, ex-president of the United States, as explained by the ancient spirit tralaka. As now the journey down the ancient streams of Mr. Bush, he has spent 3 lifetimes within that massive Draco planetary. The first 2, he was a Draco dragon, standing at 9 foot 10 inches tall and a mid-color of dark black. He had a 21-inch jawline in front of his face with 2 long rows of teeth. The outer one was naturally sharp and the inner row was flat. His nostrils at the top end of his jawline, one on each side, so to speak, though curved back and around at a 45-degree angle and curling around that 20 degrees. This gave him a wider area to be able to pick up scents and odors to distinguish between friend and foe. Now, the sides of his long jawline had various scars from many encounters in his field of his career in those lifetimes. The eyes of Mr. Bush were set back in his face because of his facial scales on his forehead. His eyes were a midnight black that missed nothing. Now, though he in those 2 lives did not have a tail, he could, though, breathe smoke through his nostrils to disguise, very interestingly here, to be able to disguise his presence as well as his departure. So he here is showing that he could really put out quite a cloud of smoke. His hands had 6 very strong fingers on each one, his feet having 6 toes on each foot that had long claws between them. The long arms of dragon muscles rippled beneath the skin. From the front of the top of his right hand to his elbow, there was 2 rows of sacred symbols that have been now starting to fade, but they were originally a neon red in color. His body's scales were mid-sized, though 3/4 of an inch thick. The career in those 2 lives was that of a fighter pilot. His very sleek space fighter craft would be stored with 4 others along the top of the main cargo ship in this fleet of cargo ships that he worked with, going to and from the Draco systems of planets and moons to other planetary systems for unique trades, and as well as trading goods and even perishable stuff, as well as picking up some side credits for leasing out the 5 fighter pilots and their ships to recover or slay beings who had not paid their customer traders what was owed. Now, in the next life in the Draco planetary system, Bush was a humanoid. Interesting here, standing at 8 feet 3.5 inches, going to a fighter school after a business he was in with his father did not work out. Eventually, though, Bush found that hiring himself out for the pioneers as the pilot with that little stopgap for the time when he would be able to leave those new settlement of pioneers, and leave those pioneers with his private ship. This was very lucrative in credits that he got from that occupation. The next 5 lifetimes brought Mr. Bush to the Vega systems of planets and moons. Strangely enough, his first life there was that of a tall gray. Very interesting here. At 8 foot 4.5 inches tall. This was a long life, very long, in which he was conditioned by the old Greys to be a space fighter pilot while helping in the role also as a mechanical scientist. maintaining crafts and also working on design. His next life was that of a human humanoid. Interesting between all the different variances of bodies that Mr. Bush has had. But that now we're talking he was a human humanoid at 9 foot 9.5 inches tall, spending here most of his life career as a transport team head pilot. He kept a very few long pieces of his luggage tied in behind his pilot's chairs, and these were filled with many different forms of fishing gear and lures. Interesting hobby he had. Fishing on different worlds was his true love. However, it was the career of being a transportation head pilot that got him to those other worlds in the first place, most of the time for free because he was contracted. Where he loved to sneak away whenever he could with his private ship and go fishing while the customers were taking care of what they do. The next 3 lives in the Vega system of planets and moons, he was again a Draco humanoid, standing at 9 feet 2 inches in height. Though having something of a humanoid form, one could very easily determine that Mr. Bush had Draco heritage in those 3 lives as a Draco humanoid. His arms and his legs rippled very abundantly with the Draco coarse but powerful muscles. A mid-tone brown scale for skin protected him from many different harsh environments in the careers that he was having. Which, interesting here though again, which was very useful for him in his career as a building engineer. Now, this title also included other engineering projects to aid other species housing on more harsh environment worlds. Mr. Bush would take off time billing them a quite substantial fee and travel to those harsher environments to aid both his workers and the citizens to be able to finish the project. But from the Vega systems now of planets Mr. Bush had been going, now he would spend the next 11 lifetimes on Tiamat. 11 lifetimes on Tiamat, or otherwise known as Maladak. 8 of those lifetimes, he was a reptilian, non-humanoid form of being, standing at 9 foot 4 inches tall, though strangely here, though, that the species he was part of, though they weren't considered to be a variable in human form, even though he had 2 arms, 2 legs, and 1 head, centered on his shoulders. Strangely enough, that species he was part of was not considered to be, once again here, a humanoid form. An interesting little thing about how these different species fit in different brackets, and while others don't fit in their own little groups. His head had a 15-inch jawline with 1 large and pointed row of teeth. In ages past, their species had during the birth time they had a deeper slit they cut on their tongue. And on the ends, they added, as they were growing up, 2 smaller slits, so then you would end up with 3 slits on the tongue, which enabled them to be able to better verbalize communication with different species. They were able to more form the words. Now, his legs on the front side had 2 rows of 2-inch tall pointed scales. On the back of his legs was 2 offsets of downward pointed claws, 6 inches long and 2 inches in diameters. Now, this is very interesting here, that this was used for during fights in which they would leap on the other one when they're in a body-to-body combat, and push hard down with that those two long claws, and right into the other being's legs or other body part muscles, so they wouldn't be able to flee, and thus the fight was over and the opponent would be dead. Now, in those 8 lifetimes, he would spend most of their time in the careers of law enforcement. Strange combinations here, putting in extra hours in the mechanics of and repair of the smaller cargo ships. Those there were very old style cargo ships that had used a variable of sulfur blends for fuel. Now, this is a very dirty fuel. It has been used in a few other places in the living universe, and probably more that I haven't been aware of yet. But it's a very dirty fuel, but he worked on these to tweak them, to be able to get more performance out of them, and not be quite as gluttonous in how polluting they were. All right. Now, the only other here, the high classes citizens on Tiamat, they would use the magnetic ring drive vehicles. The lower classes were held back and most of them had to use the sulfur blends for fuel because of restrictions. And here, once again, showing on Tiamat having a multiple caste system of civilizations. But by using the clean drive systems, the upper echelon of the higher classes of citizens of Tiamat, they would use them for transportation. But it never would seem to think under those rulers on Tiamat on what they would have benefited if they had went to a clean fuel and clean air. Now, the last 3 lives of Mr. Bush on Tiamat would strangely be, once again, as a gray, a mid-tall one here speaking. Here again shows that it does happen in some people's ancient and far past lives to be in tall gray or mid-gray, and in some situations even variables of short grays that is with an A, not an E. With their body form, their spirit being would be within for using that outer shell, there being of a gray for that lifetime or multiple lives. So very curious here. For this is for understanding one's ancient life experiences, showing that not only can spirit beings inhabit many different bodies and forms of bodies, they can also inhabit, as Tralaka has explained before, some of the different androidic body forms as lifetimes, but also reptilian beings and lizard beings, Draco dragon body forms, and then the various so many different variances of humanoid body forms. The Draco human variables of form, the reptilian humanoid forms of body, snake humanoid variations, and so many variations of gray species forms, as well as spider humanoid forms, as well as many others that the ancient Tralaka has yet to talk about. So very, very curious this is. Yet it is only the top of one slice of a very large cake that this has been viewed. This has been viewed about the variances of body forms, some variations of spirit beings can inhabit, while others will stay in much more common forms of external body for their inner spirit to be able to inhabit for those lives, where others spirit beings will be much more bolder, and they will try lifetimes in much more complicated and harder shells to use for their life, such as many humanoid variations of Draco, reptilians, and androidic bodies. But getting back to Mr. Bush, these last 3 lives of Mr. Bush on Tiamat as a mid-tall gray, standing at just 5 foot 5.5 inches tall. His conditioning, his schooling was that of being a gray fighter pilot. His other duties was that of a crystal electrician for those power systems within the bigger gray space-bound ships. Now, the following 9 lifetimes, Mr. Bush would be living on both of the planets that used to be past the orbit of Pluto. Well, of those lives, 7 of them, he was a gray hybrid, standing at 9'7" tall, at 2 of those species of grays that had big military bases. The Greys had bargained with those tall pinheaded beings, who tralaka has talked about in other videos, that they would give the Greys that land to use for Grey technology instead of going to war with that particular variation of Greys. Interesting here that one of the rare situations that the tall pinheaded species of beings that they love to be dominating over any species anywhere that they could move to or try to move to. Here is showing an instance where they are using a common sense to not go to war against the Greys, because this would be something that they would not win in. This would prove to be much too costly for those pinheaded beings. Thus, the Grey bases were on each of those two planets. Now, those 7 lives as a Grey hybrid did give Mr. Bush enough leeway in those lives to be in formal law enforcement, having his own office building he also worked out of. In 2 of those lives, he was a full-time spy. Interesting how many times in world leaders in their past ancient lives that career of spying comes into play. Interesting. For the Grey here, though, military officers, keeping very dedicated files on what the pinheaded beings were doing, as well as the reptilian species, the reptilian humanoids also, and the lizard beings, and the Draco dragons. Now, Mr. Bush's last 2 lives in that location, he was a reptilian humanoid, 8'2" tall, with the strong reptilian features on his body form. As strong as those features were, it was his diamond black eyes set deep into the eye sockets. Those eyes are quite a bit larger than normal. He also had a mysterious, thin, smoky, cloudish film that would cross his eyes, like little inner lids, that just for a fraction of a second before he would attack his enemy, either in a hand-to-hand fight or by use of weapons, made no difference to Mr. Bush. He had trained in his youth for nearly 100 different types of weapons. Not the small stuff we're talking, but a being may be able to keep hidden, but the larger weapons. But this would make very big statements just being seen with Mr. Bush. That he meant what he said when he was doing his job, and he would back it up with quite enough firepower. This usually set that mood manner of business dealing to start with right from the start. Don't mess with Mr. Bush. He spent 2 of those lives as an owner of his own business. The front of his business building had numerous holes in different spots. And no, it was not from business gone bad that came back to drive by and try to kill Mr. Bush. But there was many holes in the building that had names actually written under each hole that was in the building, in that wall, that under each one of those was a name, and it could be seen by the people, or rather beings, that were walking by or driving past his office building. Those holes and names were the fools that thought they could outwit an 8-foot 2-inch tall, fast draw reptilian humanoid as they were leaving the building. After a deal went bad with him, needless to say, the small disclaimer sign next to the entrance door simply stated, "Have the payment plan with you in full." Any idea that sounds dumb to you before you came here will most likely be what goes on your tombstone in that manner that you will be leaving Mr. Bush's office. Those 2 lives in that location for Mr. Bush would become legendary in those ancient times in a local area. Perhaps Tralaka will later explain on this in more details. But his next 6 lifetimes here, Mr. Bush would take him yet way over in another part of the local system of the living universe. It would put him into the Nibiruan system of planets. Yes, that's right. He spent 6 lives, that is Mr. Bush, in the Nibiruan system of planets. 3 of those lives as a non-humanoid reptilian. Again, that he was standing here at 8 feet 1 inch tall. He, in earlier parts of those lives, had been a space fighter pilot. Another thing that comes very strong in a Bush family is their fighter pilot in past lifetimes. In one of those lives here, talking to Mr. Bush, he owned a transportation business in the Nibiru system of planets in cargo from the local moons to the different planets there. Though at times he had much static between the different customers and the caste system of civilization. The lower caste systems here being the labor that worked the mines and made the machinery and the technology, putting it together and that stuff. Now, in those last 3 lifetimes, Mr. Bush was a reptilian humanoid, though a shorter version, standing at only 6 feet 10 and 1/2 inches tall. This made for a perfect height for being a pilot in this new generation of space flight crafts that were coming into the Nibiruan system, that were being designed in there, rather, at a time where the non-humanoid reptilian and a reptilian humanoid receiving the orders from the Nibiru top leaders. It told them to journey to the outmost moons and stop this full uprising of the short and mid-tall gray miners who had secretly sent to one of the gray species in a local planetary system a message of dire help that they were in, that the miners were in very bad situation, in which the Greys from that outlying system sent 3 mid-sized Grey fighter escort battlecrafts. These were really bristling with weapons and heavy shielding to help them. This was a very deadly but short war, though, for both the mid-tall and the short Greys. And the variable reptilians, much of the surface mining equipment to load the cargo ships were destroyed. Angering the ruling Nibiruans very, very much. All the technology in that location had been destroyed, and yet nothing was accomplished. And this higher caste civilization in Nibiru, they were venting in anger. And the Nibiruans sent their own battlecrafts to that war zone and fire at all sides of the war zone. The different Greys and the Grey crafts, as well as the reptilians that were sent there to stop it. They went in there firing at everybody until nearly nobody from that short war was still alive or being allowed to live. This set the all-new motivation for the mid-height and short gray miners and servants who worked on and in the different moons as mining crews, as well as servants for the higher echelons of the Nibiruans. However, though, the Nibiruans did agree to shorten the work hours as long as that quality of the materials would not be lessened anymore. But it would be quite a while, though, before the Nibiruans would trust to send the area reptilian and reptilian humanoids together to go fix a disagreement within the Nibiruan system of influence. Now, this didn't go over very well for the reptilians, who many of them who were born there in many generations, many generations. This would be the times that the reptilian beings and the reptilian humanoid would spend much time and thought about those Nibiruan planetary system rulers who had fired at the reptilian crafts and military personnel on the surface of that moon in the same manner that the rulers had fired on the grays, short, and mid. This would start a wedge that would be pushing between the reptilian and reptilian humanoids farther out from the grace of the Nibiruan rulers. It was that small war, very important part here. It was that particular small war that was sent Mr. Bush in that lifetime to begin with other family and friends of family and secretive military clan they began to form, investing very heavily in the short and mid-tall gray miners and assembly line buildings on different worlds in local systems for creating duplicates of military parts that were originally being made for the Nibiruans. They had their own lines going, the Bush clan, their own lines going, creating the identical parts for their own crafts. So his reptilian humanoid families would never have that embarrassment in a war again. This would carry over into many other lives the ancient spirit tralaka has not talked about yet, that Mr. Bush and levels of family would have. Always making sure to keep that private stock of their tools of the different trades in abundance and not being able to be viewed most of the time by the public. This here is the ancient spirit tralaka. As always, expand the mind, be able to understand more of what you are, what you can also become with your inner spirit and your outer expression working together for your future, both in this life and in future lives. Good night.